The truck exploded through the red light and slammed into the side of the county school bus, hard enough to fold the metal frame like a soda can, the sound of tearing steel echoing across the intersection as glass burst outward in a glittering storm across the pavement, while the bus lurched sideways and tipped against the curb in front of a small grocery store on Main Street in the Antine-Steed, quiet Wyoming town of Laramie Creek. And for 3 long seconds, nobody moved as smoke curled up from the crumpled hood of the truck, and the stunned silence hung in the air, like the world had forgotten how to breathe until someone inside the bus began screaming, and the spell shattered all at once. Sheriff Daniel Mercer had been sitting 2 blocks away in his patrol SUV, finishing a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, when the collision thundered through the town like a cannon shot, and by the time the radio on his dashboard crackled to life with frantic voices, he was already turning the ignition and punching the accelerator, tires spitting gravel as he cut across the empty intersection, toward the plume of gray smoke rising above the roofs of the storefronts. Daniel had lived in Laramie Creek his entire life, and there were only 2 sounds he feared hearing in the middle of town: a gunshot or a crash like the one that had just ripped through the quiet morning. As he pulled up beside the wreckage, the smell of antifreeze and burning rubber flooded the air, and the first thing he saw was a small sneaker lying in the road 15 feet away from the bus. He stepped out of the cruiser slowly at first, then faster, as the reality of the scene came into focus. The yellow bus tilted at an angle, with its side dented inward, children crying from inside, and the pickup truck that had hit it resting nose first against a utility pole, with the hood folded up like a broken jaw. A woman from the grocery store was already running toward the bus, shouting into her phone, her voice shaking as she tried to describe what she was seeing. Daniel forced himself to stay calm as he approached the driver's side of the bus, though the pounding in his chest made his hearing feel distant and muffled. "Everybody stay seated if you can hear me," he called up through the broken door. "We're getting you out one at a time." The bus driver, an older man named Harold Kimball, who had driven the route for nearly 20 years, was slumped against the wheel, with blood running down his forehead, but still conscious enough to nod weakly when Daniel climbed up the steps. "Sheriff," Harold muttered, voice thin with pain, came out of nowhere. Daniel glanced back through the shattered windows and saw the children packed along the seats, some crying, some silent with shock. He noticed one girl gripping the armrest beside her so tightly her knuckles were white. "You're okay," he told them, in the firm, steady voice he used whenever panic started to rise in a crowd. "We're going to get you out." He helped the first child down the steps just as the distant wail of sirens began to echo across town. Volunteer firefighters and EMTs racing from the station a mile away. As the girl reached the pavement, she burst into tears and ran into the arms of the woman from the grocery store, who had dropped her phone on the sidewalk and knelt to comfort her. Daniel moved quickly, guiding the next child and the next, until the bus slowly emptied. Only when the last boy climbed down did Daniel turn toward the pickup truck, where the driver remained motionless behind the wheel. The door was bent inward, and Daniel had to yank twice before it opened with a screech. The man inside was in his late 40s, thick beard, construction jacket, the smell of alcohol strong enough to cut through the gasoline fumes. Daniel checked his pulse. Still alive. Barely. "You hear me?" Daniel asked quietly, though the man didn't respond. A paramedic rushed over moments later with a stretcher, and the town erupted into organized chaos as emergency crews began triaging the injured. For a moment, Daniel stood in the middle of the scene, watching it unfold. The flashing lights painting the storefront windows red and blue, the voices overlapping in anxious fragments, and a strange, cold realization crept into his chest. This crash was going to change things in Laramie Creek. He just didn't know how yet. 2 hours later, the emergency vehicles were gone, and yellow police tape fluttered across the intersection like a warning flag, while Daniel stood beside the wrecked bus, making notes in a small leather notebook. The driver of the truck had been airlifted to the county hospital in Cheyenne. 2 children had broken bones. 1 remained unconscious. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. His deputy, Marcus Delgado, approached from the other side of the road, carrying a plastic evidence bag with a half-empty whiskey bottle inside. "Found it under the passenger seat," Marcus said. Daniel sighed. "So he was drunk?" Marcus nodded. "Looks that way." A group of parents had begun gathering behind the police tape, their faces tight with fear as they waited for updates about their children. Daniel watched them for a moment before turning away. He had seen the same look too many times in his 20 years as sheriff, the silent calculation people made when they realized their life might never return to what it had been that morning. "What's the driver's name?" Daniel asked. Marcus flipped through a small notebook. "Travis Holt. Works at the Hanson construction yard." The name meant nothing to Daniel at first, but Marcus hesitated before adding quietly, "He's the father of Ethan Holt. Kid who sits 2 rows behind the driver." Daniel's head snapped up. "Ethan was on the bus?" Marcus nodded slowly. Paramedics said he's the one still unconscious. Daniel stared down the empty road where the ambulance had disappeared earlier and felt a tight knot form in his stomach. Jesus. The sheriff's office sat at the edge of town across from a church parking lot where children often rode their bikes in the evening. By the time Daniel returned that afternoon, the sun had shifted behind a bank of gray clouds, and the wind carried the faint smell of rain. Inside the office, Marcus was already typing up the initial incident report, while the police radio murmured softly in the background. Daniel hung his hat on the wall and sat at his desk, but he couldn't focus on the paperwork in front of him. Instead, his thoughts drifted back to the sneaker in the road. "You ever notice how fast things change?" Daniel said suddenly. Marcus looked up from the computer. "Sheriff?" Daniel leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. 1 minute, it's a normal morning. Kids riding the bus to school. Next minute, everything's broken. Marcus didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "That's kind of the job." Daniel nodded, though the words didn't comfort him the way they once had. Across town at the county hospital, Ethan Holt lay in a narrow bed surrounded by humming machines while his mother, Claire Holt, sat beside him, gripping his hand so tightly the skin around her fingers had turned pale. She had arrived 30 minutes earlier after receiving the phone call that every parent feared. The doctor had spoken carefully, choosing each word like it might explode if handled wrong. "He suffered a head injury," the doctor explained. "We're monitoring swelling in the brain. The next 24 hours are critical." Claire barely heard the rest. Her husband Travis was somewhere in surgery after causing the crash that had nearly killed their son. The knowledge moved through her chest like a blade twisting slowly deeper. She looked down at Ethan's still face and whispered, "I'm here, baby." Outside the hospital room, 2 nurses spoke quietly near the desk, unaware that Claire could hear them through the half-open door. "They said the father was drunk," one of them murmured. The other shook her head. "God, imagine living with that." Claire closed her eyes. The shame felt heavier than grief. Meanwhile, Sheriff Daniel Mercer sat alone in his office long after Marcus had gone home, the file on the crash open in front of him. Rain began tapping softly against the window. He flipped through the documents again until he reached the toxicology report from the emergency team. Blood alcohol level far above the legal limit. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. In a small town like Laramie Creek, justice was never simple. Travis Holt would face charges. The town would demand accountability. But Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the boy lying unconscious in the hospital. Punishing the father might destroy the only family that child had left. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight as Daniel stared at the report. The quiet office filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights. Somewhere deep in his chest, a familiar unease began to grow. The feeling he had learned to trust over the years whenever a case refused to fit neatly into the box people expected. Because something about this crash felt wrong. Not the drunken driving. That part was painfully common. It was something else. Something buried beneath the wreckage that hadn't revealed itself yet. And Daniel Mercer had learned a long time ago that the truth in a small town rarely stayed hidden forever. By sunrise, he was still in the office, tie loosened, coffee gone cold again, staring at the collision photos spread across his desk, while a pale strip of morning light crept through the blinds and cut the room into bars of gray and gold. He had looked at the images enough times that most men would have stopped seeing anything new in them. But Daniel had built a career on studying the details people stepped over when they were tired, angry, or certain they already understood the story. The truck had entered the intersection from the westbound lane at high speed. The bus had been halfway through the green light when the impact came, straightforward on paper, open and shut if a prosecutor wanted it to be. Drunk father. Crashed into bus. Child critically injured. Town ready for blood. But Daniel kept circling back to one photograph Marcus had taken before the vehicles were removed. A shot of the pickup's front wheels turned slightly left. It wasn't much. It could have meant nothing. A reflex. A skid correction. But paired with the witness statement from the grocery clerk, who said the truck never braked, it sat in Daniel's mind like a splinter. If Travis Holt had seen the bus, why turn instead of braking? And if he hadn't seen it, why turn at all? At 7:15, Marcus walked in carrying a cardboard tray with 2 fresh coffees and stopped when he saw the sheriff still at his desk. "You ever go home?" Marcus asked. Daniel took 1 cup and nodded toward the photos. "You read the witness interviews?" Marcus sat across from him. All 6, mostly the same. Truck was flying. Bus had the right of way. Loud impact. Screaming. Nothing surprising. Daniel slid 1 statement across the desk. "Missus. Weller from the hardware store says the truck drifted into the oncoming lane for maybe half a second before the crash." Marcus skimmed it. Could have been drunk weaving. Could have been. Daniel picked up the photograph with the turned wheels. Could also be he was trying to avoid something. Marcus frowned. "You think somebody ran him off?" "I think I don't know enough yet." Marcus studied him for a moment. Town already decided what happened. Daniel gave a humorless smile. Town usually decides by lunchtime. He stood, grabbed his hat, and headed for the door. Let's go see if the world agrees with them. Outside, Laramie Creek was waking into one of those cold, bright mornings that made everything look cleaner than it really was. The diner across from the courthouse had steam on the windows, and pickup trucks parked crooked out front. The church bell rang once on the half hour. A pair of teenagers in school hoodies crossed Main Street whispering about the wreck, with the kind of fascinated dread teenagers always carried around tragedy, as if every disaster was both terrifying and secretly educational. Daniel noticed how many heads turned when he and Marcus walked by. News moved fast in town, and the sheriff's face usually told people whether to be relieved or afraid. Today, he kept his expression unreadable. Their first stop was Hanson Construction on the south edge of town, where half-built subdivisions stood in neat skeletal rows against the open land like unfinished promises. Earl Hanson met them near the equipment shed with a cigarette tucked behind one ear and a phone pressed to his palm. He was a thick-set man in his 60s with a face sun-baked into permanent irritation. "Sheriff," he said, already defensive. "If this is about Travis, I told the deputy last night. The man was off the clock. I'm not here about liability," Daniel said. "I'm here about his day yesterday." Earl shifted. "He showed up late. That's all." Marcus opened his notebook. "How late?" "Hour and a half, maybe." "Acting drunk?" Marcus asked. Earl hesitated just long enough to matter. "Hungover, maybe. Not drunk." Daniel glanced at the job board on the wall behind Earl. Names and sites written in black marker. Travis Holt's name had been crossed out with a thick line. "Did he work the whole day?" Daniel asked. Earl removed the cigarette from behind his ear and rolled it between his fingers. "No. Left around 2. Said he needed to handle something at the bank." "Did he seem upset?" Daniel asked. Earl looked toward the unfinished houses. "You know how men get when they're behind on everything. Money, marriage, work." He had that look. What look? Like he'd been arguing with somebody in his own head for too long. Daniel held his gaze. "Did he argue with anyone here?" Earl shook his head, then thought better of it. Foreman chewed him out. Travis snapped back. "Nothing unusual." "About what?" "Missing deliveries last week. Sloppy work. Showing up smelling like a bar stool." Marcus wrote quickly. Daniel let the silence stretch. Earl hated silence. Most people did. "There was another thing," Earl muttered finally. "He asked if I'd seen a dark SUV around the site. Said it had been parked out on County Road 9 2 days in a row. Thought somebody was watching him." Marcus looked up. "Did you see it?" Earl shrugged. "We get trucks, contractors, salesmen, nosy neighbors. I didn't make a note of every damn vehicle." Daniel filed it away without reacting. "Who was he at the bank to see?" Earl snorted. "Probably nobody. Probably debt. Everybody sees debt." They thanked him and headed back to the cruiser. Marcus shut the passenger door and said, "Dark SUV. You buying that?" Daniel started the engine. "I'm buying that Travis thought somebody was watching him. Paranoid drunks think a lot of things." "Yeah," Daniel said, pulling onto the road. "Sometimes they think true things for the wrong reasons." The bank manager was less eager to talk, mostly because he had spent the morning on the phone with worried customers who had heard the name Holt and were suddenly remembering every rumor about overdue loans in town. But once Daniel showed the warrant for security footage, the man softened enough to lead them into a small office with a monitor mounted on the wall. They scrubbed through the video from the previous afternoon until Travis appeared. Shoulders hunched, baseball cap pulled low, moving with the restless agitation of a man trying not to look desperate. He was at the teller window for less than 5 minutes before leaving empty-handed. "No transaction?" Daniel asked. The manager checked the records. "Overdraft. Account frozen." He argued about it. "Anybody meet him outside?" Marcus asked. The manager rewound the exterior camera. Travis emerged through the front doors, stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, and looked across the street. "Pause that," Daniel said. On the screen, parked under the awning of a closed pharmacy, sat a black SUV, dark tint, out-of-county plates, though the camera resolution blurred the numbers. Travis stood still for 1 second, then turned sharply and walked toward his truck without looking back. "You know that vehicle?" Daniel asked. The manager squinted. "No." Daniel watched Travis on the screen one more time. Even through the grainy footage, the fear in the man's posture was plain once you knew to look for it. "Can you send us a copy?" he asked. "Today." Back in the cruiser, Marcus exhaled through his nose. So maybe somebody really was watching him. Daniel stared through the windshield. Or collecting a debt, or trying to scare him, or waiting for him to break. Marcus shifted in his seat. "You think this changes the charges?" "Depends what happened after he left the bank." Their next stop was County Hospital in Cheyenne. where Claire Holt sat in a vinyl chair beside Ethan's bed, wearing yesterday's sweater, and the same expression people wore after grief had wrung all the tears out of them and left them hollow. She looked up when Daniel entered, and for a moment her face tightened as if she expected accusation before he had even spoken. "How is he?" Daniel asked quietly. Claire looked at her son. Bandages wrapped his forehead. There was dried blood near one ear. No nurse had fully cleaned. "Still asleep," she said. "They say that can be normal." She said it like she was repeating a sentence she did not believe, but could not afford to stop saying. Daniel stepped closer to the bed. Ethan looked younger, unconscious. All the defiance and quick wit of 12 stripped away until he was just a child again. "Can we talk outside?" Daniel asked. Claire hesitated, kissed 2 fingers and pressed them lightly to Ethan's hand, then followed Daniel into the corridor. The vending machines buzzed under fluorescent lights. An orderly pushed a linen cart past them without looking up. Claire crossed her arms, holding herself together. "You're here to ask how much Travis had to drink," she said. "I'm here to ask about yesterday." Claire laughed once, short and bitter. "Yesterday feels like 3 years ago." Daniel kept his voice even. "Did he mention anybody following him?" That made her eyes flick up, just for a second, then away. Why? Because his boss said he was worried about a dark SUV. Claire stared at the vending machine glass where her reflection hovered ghost-like over rows of candy bars. "He said some men had come by the house last week." "What men?" "I don't know." "You didn't ask?" "Of course I asked." Her composure cracked. Not into tears, but anger. "He said it was nothing. He said I was already stressed enough. He said he could handle it." Daniel waited. She breathed in slowly, and went on. "They came in the afternoon while Ethan was at school. 2 men in work jackets, but not from any company I knew. One of them never spoke. The other asked if Travis was home. I said no. He asked when he'd be back. I said I didn't know. He smiled at me like he knew I was lying. Then they left." "Did you report it?" Claire's expression hardened. "To who?" "The sheriff, whose office mostly handles drunk tourists and missing fence posts. My husband owed money. I assumed it was related to that." Daniel accepted the jab. She was frightened, exhausted, and half drowning in shame. People in that state rarely aimed carefully. "Did Travis say who he owed?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "He had credit cards, late bills, a truck payment, some payday loans maybe. I never got the full list because every time I tried, he'd either get defensive or promise he was fixing it." She rubbed both hands over her face. "He wasn't always like this." "Like what?" Daniel asked. Claire's eyes reddened but stayed dry. "Weak." The word hung there longer than either of them expected. "We had hard years before," she said more softly. "When Ethan was little and Travis got laid off, when my mother moved in and needed care, when the roof went out, he used to face things. Then somewhere along the way, he started hiding from them. A few beers turned into a case. One lie turned into 5. He kept saying he was protecting us from worry, but mostly he was protecting himself from being seen as a failure." Daniel nodded once. "Did he leave home angry yesterday?" "He left scared." She looked down the corridor toward Ethan's room. "That's worse." Daniel found Travis 2 floors up under guard in a recovery room with a shattered collarbone, cracked ribs, and a fresh line of stitches across his scalp. He looked older than 48 now, his skin gray with pain and sedation. But when Daniel stepped inside, Travis's eyes sharpened with immediate dread. "How bad is Ethan?" he whispered. Daniel pulled a chair near the bed, still unconscious. Travis shut his eyes as if the words had physical weight. His lips trembled once, then steadied. Daniel let the silence sit. This was the part of the job most people misunderstood. Not the arrest, not the paperwork, not the sirens. The waiting. The careful reading of a face when guilt and fear fought for space. "You were seen at the bank yesterday," Daniel said. Travis kept his eyes closed. "Yeah. Saw a black SUV outside." Travis opened his eyes again. "You checked." "I check things." Travis swallowed painfully. "Then you know I wasn't crazy." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Tell me who was following you." Travis stared at the ceiling. "I borrowed money." "From a bank?" "No." "How much?" "Too much." "That's not a number." Travis looked toward the window. 30,000. Marcus, standing near the door, shifted his weight. Daniel kept his tone flat. "From who?" Travis hesitated long enough that Daniel knew the answer mattered. "A man out of Casper. Name was Wade Grinnell." Daniel knew the name. Not a kingpin, not some cinematic villain. Worse, in a way. A quiet lender who floated around job sites and bars and county fairs, offering easy money to men who had already run out of respectable ways to fail. "You borrowed 30,000 from Wade Grinnell," Daniel said. For what? Travis laughed weakly, disgusted with himself. Started with 8. Then 12. Then I kept borrowing to cover what I owed before. Thought I'd catch up when Earl gave me that supervisor bump. Didn't happen. And Grinnell sent people? Daniel asked. Travis nodded once. At first they just called. Then they started showing up places. Work, home, parking lots. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. Enough for what? Enough to make me feel like they could reach Ethan before I ever saw them coming. His voice broke on the boy's name. He turned his face away. Daniel waited until he could speak again. Yesterday morning, one of them called and said if I didn't have 10 grand by noon, they'd stop being patient. So you drank, Daniel said. Travis shut his eyes again. I drank before the bank, couple shots in the truck, told myself it was to stop shaking. Then what? They were outside the bank. Same SUV. I knew I didn't have the money. I drove around for an hour trying to think. I called Claire twice and hung up before it rang. I thought about leaving town. I thought about driving into the hills and just disappearing for a day. He sucked in a shallow breath. Then I saw the bus. Daniel said nothing. Travis's eyes filled. I wasn't aiming for it. The words came out fast, desperate. Jesus Christ. I wasn't. Something was behind me. I looked in the mirror and saw that SUV 2 cars back. I turned at the light because I thought maybe if I cut through town, I could lose them. I reached for the bottle on the floor. I know how that sounds. I know. Then I looked up, and the bus was there. His voice collapsed into a whisper. I tried to turn. Daniel studied him. Broken men could lie as easily as powerful ones, but the lie usually bent toward self-preservation. What Travis was saying made him look weak, reckless, pathetic, and monstrously careless. That often meant it was true, or true enough. Did the SUV hit you? Daniel asked. No. Run the light too? I don't know. I don't know. Travis started shaking harder. Whether from pain or guilt, Daniel couldn't tell. I hurt my kid. Daniel stood. You did. Travis's face twisted, as if Daniel had struck him. Then he nodded once, accepting it because there was no place left to hide from it. Outside the room, Marcus blew out a breath. So now we've got loan shark pressure, stalking, drunk driving, and a kid in a coma. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. And a town that still only knows the drunk driving part. You going after Grinnell? Marcus asked. If we can prove criminal intimidation. Yes. And Travis? Daniel looked through the small window in the door. Travis lay with his arm pinned, face turned toward the wall. The posture of a man who had finally run out of excuses, and found that truth offered no shelter either. Travis still chose the bottle, Daniel said. Pressure explains. Doesn't erase. That afternoon, Laramie Creek High emptied early because half the staff were distracted, and the other half were parents of children on the bus. Reporters from Cheyenne had started calling. Social media had already turned the collision into a clean morality play about an alcoholic father who destroyed his own son's life. Daniel hated stories that cleaned themselves up that fast. They were almost always hiding the filth underneath. He and Marcus spent the next 3 hours pulling traffic cameras from the 2 gas stations at the west end of town, and finally caught the black SUV on one distant angle 20 minutes before the crash, passing Travis's truck on Route 14, and then slowing almost immediately as if to let him catch up. That's not random, Marcus said. Daniel nodded. Get the plate enhanced. Already sent it. The call came at 5:42. The plate traced to a rental out of Casper. Paid with a prepaid card. No driver listed under a real name. Daniel stood by the evidence board in his office, staring at the printed stills, while Marcus pinned them up. The board now held the crash photos, the bank image, the gas station camera, a map of Travis's route, and a yellow note with Wade Grinnell's name, written in thick black marker. It looked like the start of a larger case, which meant trouble, because larger cases in small towns did not just expose criminals, they exposed systems of silence. You think Grinnell works alone? Marcus asked. Daniel thought of Claire at the vending machine, saying Travis had become weak. Thought of Earl Hansen brushing off the SUV. Thought of how debt moved through towns like this. Private and contagious. Men passing ruin to each other quietly, to avoid the humiliation of saying out loud that they were drowning. Nobody like that works alone, Daniel said. Not here. So, what's the move? Daniel looked at the clock, then out the window at the church parking lot, where evening shadows were stretching across the asphalt. Town hall starts in 20 minutes. Marcus gave him a tired look. You really want to go stand in front of half the county right now? No. Daniel grabbed his hat. Which probably means I should. The meeting was being held in the fellowship hall behind First Baptist because the school auditorium was unavailable and because churches in towns like Laramie Creek ended up hosting every kind of grief. whether or not God had been invited. By the time Daniel arrived, the folding chairs were nearly full. Parents, teachers, ranchers, cashiers, 2 county commissioners, and 3 people who came to every public meeting because outrage had become their main hobby. The room smelled like coffee, lemon floor cleaner, and cold and air from coats hung by the entrance. Claire was not there, which Daniel was grateful for. She did not need this yet. School Superintendent Nora Bell stood near the front, wringing her hands while whispers moved through the room like static. When Daniel walked in, the whispers sharpened. He took his place beside Nora and looked out at faces he had known for decades, men he had hunted with, women who had babysat his daughter when she was small, people who trusted him right up until justice threatened to become complicated. Nora cleared her throat and gave a brief update on the injured students. When she finished, a father in the second row stood up without waiting to be recognized. "Is that man being charged or not?" he demanded. "My daughter's got a cast on both arms because some drunk bastard climbed behind a wheel." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Daniel stepped forward. "The investigation is ongoing. Charges are being prepared." "What investigation?" Another voice snapped. "He was drunk. He ran a red light. His own boy's in the hospital. What else is there to investigate?" Daniel let them spend themselves for a few seconds. Then he spoke in the same steady tone he had used on the bus. "A criminal case that doesn't hold up in court helps nobody. We are building it correctly." That calmed some and aggravated others. A woman near the back rose with tears already in her eyes. "My son was on that bus. He can't sleep. He keeps hearing the crash. You telling us to be patient feels real easy when it ain't your child waking up screaming." Daniel absorbed that without defending himself. "You're right," he said. "It is easy for me to say that. It's harder for you to live it. But I'm still asking for patience." The room shifted slightly at that. He had learned long ago that people often wanted acknowledgement before they wanted answers. An older rancher named Calvin Price stood slowly from the side aisle. "Heard there might have been other folks involved," he said. The room quieted in a different way now, curiosity replacing outrage. Daniel did not look at Marcus. "We are examining all relevant evidence," he said carefully. Calvin squinted. "That mean yes?" "That means I won't talk beyond what we can prove." "That's politician talk," someone muttered. Daniel's jaw tightened. "No. Politician talk is promising certainty before the facts are in. I'm giving you the opposite." There was a beat of silence. Then from the front row came a voice low and raw. "If there were people threatening Travis, I want to know." Daniel looked down and saw Claire's sister Megan, who must have slipped in late. Her eyes were swollen from crying but sharp with anger. "Because if Ethan dies and some coward loan shark had a hand in it, I don't want that buried under everyone saying Travis was just some deadbeat drunk." The room reacted all at once. Loan shark, threats, speculation ignited instantly. Daniel raised a hand. "Enough. Nobody is burying anything, and nobody in this room is going to turn rumor into fact before my office does the work." His voice had hardened now, enough that the room quieted again. "A boy is fighting to wake up in a hospital bed. Other children are scared to ride to school. Families are breaking in real time. So hear me clearly. You do not help them by feeding on gossip because gossip feels easier than grief." For the first time all evening, the room went still. Daniel held it there. "When I have facts I can share, I will share them. Until then, you let us do the job." After the meeting, while people shuffled out into the cold night in knots of whispered conversation, Marcus approached with his phone in hand. "Cheyenne PD called," he said quietly. "They found the rental SUV." Daniel turned. "Where?" "Abandoned at a motel off the interstate. No driver. One print on the steering wheel came back partial, but enough to flag a known associate of Grinnell, guy named Leon Voss." Daniel looked toward the dark church windows, reflecting the parking lot lights. The case had just crossed from suspicion into shape. "Put out the bolo," he said, "and call the county attorney. I want warrants moving tonight." Marcus nodded, then lowered his voice. "There's more." Daniel waited. "Hospital called while we were in the meeting." Ethan opened his eyes for maybe 10 seconds. Daniel felt something in his chest loosen and tighten at once. Did he speak? No, but he squeezed the nurse's hand. For a moment, the noise of the parking lot fell away. Not because everything was getting better. It wasn't. The boy waking would not unbreak bones or erase shame or save his father from charges or make the town gentler. But it changed the emotional map of the whole thing. Hope, once reintroduced, complicated every decision after it. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I'm heading to Cheyenne." Marcus nodded. "I'll meet you after I file the warrant requests." Daniel reached his cruiser and paused with one hand on the door, looking back at the church where people were still emerging into the cold in small clusters. each carrying a different version of the same story home with them. In the distance, a freight train sounded low across the plain. He thought of Ethan's small hand squeezing a nurse's fingers, thought of Travis in his hospital bed with the full weight of his choices finally sitting on his chest, thought of Wade Grinnell somewhere out in the dark, learning that a crash meant to keep one desperate man in line had instead dragged light onto things people preferred to settle quietly. Then Daniel got into the cruiser and started south towards Cheyenne, with the highway unwinding ahead of him under a hard Wyoming sky, knowing the next truths were going to cost people more than they were ready to lose. Daniel kept the cruiser at 10 over the limit on the dark southbound highway, while the town receded in his rearview mirror and open land took over on both sides, black fences cutting across pale stretches of winter grass and the far mountains sitting like a bruise against the horizon. The road gave him room to think, which he sometimes hated. Every flashing sign and passing truck left him alone again with the shape of the case. Travis Holt was guilty. That part no longer lived in doubt. He had drunk. He had driven. He had hit a bus full of children. Daniel knew the county attorney would have a dozen possible charges lined up before dawn. But guilt had layers, and the deeper layers were often the ones that poisoned a town for years after the headlines stopped. If Wade Grinnell's men had leaned on Travis, followed him, cornered him in public, and pushed him toward panic, then the crash stopped being just one man's collapse. It became a chain, and Daniel had spent enough years wearing the badge to know that chains were harder for communities to face because they implicated more than one failure. They suggested that what had happened had been preventable long before the impact. His phone buzzed on the console. He tapped speaker. Mercer. Claire's voice came through unsteady and tired. They said you're coming down here. Daniel softened his tone. I am. There was a pause filled with hospital noise in the background, shoes squeaking, a distant overhead page, a metal cart rattling somewhere out of earshot. He opened his eyes again, Claire said. For longer this time. Daniel let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's good. He looked at me, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. I don't know if he knew it was me, but he looked. Daniel pictured her sitting rigid by the bed, trying not to frighten the child with the size of her relief. I'll be there soon, he said. She didn't hang up right away. Sheriff. Yeah. Another silence. Did Travis tell you everything? Daniel considered how much truth a person could bear in one night. He told me enough to move forward. Claire inhaled shakily. I don't know if I want Ethan to know who his father was today. Daniel drove past a truck stop lit too brightly in the dark, the neon gas prices flickering at the edge of his vision. Today isn't forever, he said. No, Claire murmured, but forever gets built out of days like this. The line clicked dead. Daniel drove on. Cheyenne Regional at night had the tired, fluorescent look of every hospital that had seen too much and slept too little. The lobby television was muted above rows of empty chairs. A security guard nodded Daniel through with the distracted politeness of a man who recognized authority but had no energy left to care about it. Claire was outside Ethan's room with a styrofoam cup of coffee she had clearly forgotten to drink. Her hair was tied back badly. Her face looked both older and younger than it had that afternoon, as though hope had cracked through the exhaustion but not relieved it. He's sleeping again, she said before Daniel could ask. Doctor says that's normal too. You eat anything? Daniel asked. Claire almost smiled. Mold. That bad, huh? You look like a woman trying to survive on vending machine, pretzels, and adrenaline. Close. He handed her a protein bar from his coat pocket. She looked at it, then at him. You carry these around for grieving mothers. I carry them around because my blood sugar drops, and I become a difficult public servant. That earned him the faintest huff of real amusement, which vanished quickly but mattered anyway. Claire unwrapped the bar slowly. What happens now? She asked. Daniel glanced through the small window into Ethan's room. The boy's chest rose and fell beneath the blanket, machines marking time around him. Now I keep pulling at threads until the whole thing stops pretending to be simpler than it is. Claire chewed once, not tasting it. That sounds expensive. Daniel looked at her. Usually is. She leaned back against the wall. Travis always said he could handle men like Wade by himself, like asking for help would make him smaller. A lot of men were raised on that lie, Daniel said. Some of them pass it down like family silver. Claire stared at the floor tiles. His dad did. Mean drunk. Never hit Travis where people could see it. But he taught him that weakness was worse than cruelty. Daniel absorbed that. These were the quiet inheritances that never showed up in reports but explained whole lives. Did Travis ever tell Ethan that kind of thing? Claire's jaw tightened. Not directly, but kids hear what parents worship. A doctor stepped out of the room and gave Claire a brief, encouraging update. Brain swelling stable. Response improving. Next, 48 hours, still important. The kind of hope hospitals issued carefully, as if too much of it at once could trigger collapse. After the doctor left, Claire said, I used to think if we just got through the money problems, everything else would settle. Like all our fights were really about bills. But the money just stripped the paint off. Underneath it was shame. Then fear. Then lying. Then me acting like I couldn't smell any of it because I was too busy trying to keep Ethan normal. Daniel nodded once. People don't break all at once. They break in installments. Claire looked at him, and for the first time since the crash, there was curiosity in her grief. You sound like you've seen that before. Daniel gave a tired smile. That's because I'm over 50 and work in a county where people mostly call me on the worst day of their year. Before she could answer, Marcus called. Daniel stepped farther down the corridor. Talk to me. Warrants are in motion, Marcus said. County attorney wants Grinnell picked up on intimidation, extortion, and whatever conspiracy angle we can support if Leon Voss flips. Also, I got something from the motel. Daniel pressed the phone tighter to his ear. Go on. Room register was fake name, but housekeeping found a torn envelope in the trash. Local address written on the front. Not Travis's. Belongs to Councilman Peter Weller. Daniel stopped walking. Hardware store Weller. The one and the same. Daniel looked through the window at Ethan, then down the blank hospital corridor. Peter Weller sat on the town council, chaired the zoning committee, donated to church roof repairs, and liked to give speeches about self-reliance at ribbon cuttings. He also had more influence over construction permits than most people realized. That's not proof, Daniel said. No, but it's enough to make me itch. It should. Marcus lowered his voice. There's one more thing. Leon Voss's partial print also came back on an old impound from 9 months ago. Unreported intimidation complaint, basically buried because the victim refused to cooperate. Who was the victim? Names redacted in the quick file pull, but the location was Hansen Construction. Daniel's mind moved fast now. Earl Hansen. Missing deliveries. Crossed out names. Men taking quiet cash to bridge payroll. Or worse. Stay on it, Daniel said. I'm heading back. You just got there. Now I know why I can't stay. He ended the call and returned to Claire. I have to go back to town. She read the shift in his face immediately. Something changed. Something clarified. About Travis? About people around Travis. Claire's shoulders sagged. There are always people around the man who screws up. That's what nobody tells you. You think the marriage is just the two of you. Then one day, you realize it's also his boss, his father's ghost, 3 creditors, 2 drinking buddies, every lie he told himself, and the version of you that kept choosing hope because the alternative felt humiliating. Daniel had no answer for that, so he gave her the only thing he could. I'll come back when I know more. She nodded toward Ethan's room. Just make sure knowing more matters. Daniel drove north harder than he had driven south. Not recklessly, but with the focused speed of a man who could feel a window narrowing. He reached Laramie Creek close to midnight, when most houses were dark and the town looked innocent again from a distance, the way all places did, when the people inside them were asleep and not actively disappointing each other. Marcus was waiting in the office with a pot of coffee that smelled burnt enough to strip paint. The evidence board had grown. Weller's photo was now pinned near Grinnell's name. Earl Hansen sat beside it. The map had fresh circles and arrows. Tell me everything, Daniel said. Marcus handed him a file. Peter Weller made 3 cash withdrawals over the last 6 months that don't fit his known accounts. Also had dinner twice in Cheyenne with a shell company tied to Grinnell's loans. No direct paper line to criminal activity yet, but enough smoke to choke on. Daniel flipped pages. And Hansen. Quiet tax trouble. Delayed payroll twice last year. 2 workers quit suddenly after disputes over missing wages. One of them filed that intimidation complaint and then vanished to Nebraska. Marcus tapped another page. I talked to dispatch archives. Complaint never went anywhere because the guy called back and withdrew it. Said he made a mistake. Daniel set the file down. Or somebody convinced him he had. Marcus nodded grimly. My guess. Hansen borrows from Grinnell to keep sites running. Grinnell uses Weller to smooth permit pressure and steer desperate contractors his way. Men like Travis get trapped in the middle. Daniel stared at the board. Predatory loans tied to town development and political cover. Jesus. Small town version, Marcus said. No private jets. Same rot. Daniel rubbed his jaw. We need statements before this spreads, and everyone lawyers up. Marcus gave him a look. At midnight. Especially at midnight. Fear tells the truth easier when it's tired. Their first stop was Peter Weller's house. A broad brick place with tasteful porch lights, and the kind of landscaping meant to imply discipline. Weller answered in flannel pajama pants and a university sweatshirt, irritation arriving before recognition. Sheriff, bit late for neighborly visits. Daniel held up the warrant. Good thing this isn't one. Weller's face changed by degrees, annoyance thinning into calculation. Come in. His wife appeared at the end of the hallway in a robe, took one look at Daniel and Marcus, and retreated without a word. Weller led them into a den lined with framed town certificates and photos from charity fundraisers. Daniel remained standing. Your address was found in a motel room rented by an associate of Wade Grinnell, he said. Weller crossed his arms. That's not illegal. Depends why it was there. Maybe someone wanted directions to the hardware store. Marcus almost smiled at that, but didn't. Daniel stepped closer to a shelf holding a plaque from the Laramie Creek Civic Improvement Committee. You've had dinner with entities linked to Grinnell. Weller shrugged. I have dinner with a lot of developers. You're not a developer. I'm on zoning. Exactly. Weller's eyes hardened. You should be careful, Daniel. Throwing mud at elected officials because you're under pressure from a bad accident doesn't end well. Daniel did not flinch. A boy is in the hospital because men around this town have been squeezing desperate people and pretending it's just business. Weller's nostrils flared. That drunk man chose his bottle. Yes, he did. Daniel, let the words land. But don't confuse his guilt with your innocence. Weller looked at Marcus, then back to Daniel, trying to decide whether denial or offense would serve him better. He chose offense. You're out of your depth. Maybe, Daniel said, but I'm in your living room with a warrant, which means depth's already become your problem. They seized financial records, 2 phones, and a locked desk box that Weller objected to too late. Inside the box were handwritten notes, permit parcel numbers, and a short list of names with amounts beside them. Travis Holt's amount sat third from the bottom. Weller stared at the paper as Marcus bagged it. That's campaign fundraising, he said too quickly. Daniel met his eyes. Campaigns don't usually track interest. From there, they drove to Earl Hansen's ranch house beyond the subdivision lots. Earl answered the door armed with indignation and a shotgun he was smart enough not to raise. Put it down, Daniel said. Earl cursed under his breath and leaned the weapon against the wall. You people lose your minds tonight. Maybe, Marcus said. But we brought paperwork. Inside the kitchen, beneath a hanging calendar marked with overdue supplier calls, Earl lasted 7 minutes before cracking. Not fully. Men like Earl rarely collapsed theatrically. They leaked. A contradiction here, a correction there, sweat forming at the temples, voice getting too loud, then suddenly too measured. Daniel kept him moving through the timeline until the shape emerged. Hansen Construction had overextended on 2 county-adjacent developments after Weller privately assured Earl the permits would clear. Costs rose. Loans tightened. Earl borrowed from Grinnell to keep crews paid and materials flowing. Grinnell, in return, wanted access to vulnerable workers who could be pushed into side loans when their own finances slipped. Travis Holt became one of those side loans after an injury left him behind on bills. Weller, needing the developments to keep moving and his own quiet kickbacks undiscovered, helped keep the system socially protected by dismissing complaints and labeling borrowers unreliable when they started making noise. You think that sounds criminal, Earl snapped at one point. But half this state runs on favors and pressure. Daniel stared at him. Pressure isn't a synonym for extortion, Earl. Earl slammed a palm against the table. You think I wanted any of this? I was trying to keep 40 men employed. And how many did you decide were acceptable losses? Daniel asked. Earl looked away. That was the moment Daniel knew the man understood his own guilt completely and had simply learned to file it under necessity. He had seen that category before too. Did Grinnell order Travis followed yesterday? Daniel asked. Earl swallowed. I don't know what he ordered. I know Leon said they needed to remind him. Remind him of what? That family men pay faster when they're scared. Marcus's pen stopped moving for 1 second. Silence filled the kitchen like floodwater. Earl closed his eyes. That's all I heard. You hear Leon say that here? Daniel asked. Earl nodded once. 3 days ago. And you did nothing. Earl looked back at Daniel with sudden, ugly honesty. I thought he meant scare him into paying. I didn't think anybody was going to hit a school bus. Daniel felt anger rise clean and cold in him. That's the luxury cowards always think they're buying. Control over how evil cashes out. By dawn, the arrests were underway. Weller was brought in from his own den, still insisting this was a misunderstanding and threatening to call every state contact he had. Earl Hansen came quieter, as if confession had already started the punishment and the handcuffs were only administrative. Warrants for Grinnell and Leon Voss were expanded statewide. A local news crew set up outside the sheriff's office by 6:30. The county attorney arrived with the excited exhaustion of a man who had just realized the simple crash case he expected had become a broader corruption prosecution. Daniel hated his expression on sight, not because it was wrong, but because career energy around tragedy always made his skin crawl. "This is going to get noisy," the attorney said. "It already is," Daniel replied. By mid-morning, Laramie Creek was dividing into camps the way small towns always did when scandal touched respected names. Some blamed Travis and said the rest was distraction. Some blamed the lenders and said Travis had been prey. Some blamed everyone equally, which sounded mature and was often just a tidier way of avoiding the moral discomfort of degrees. Daniel moved through the office like a man sweeping broken glass, handling calls from the state, approving searches, redirecting reporters, and trying not to let the case become theater. Around noon, he drove back to Cheyenne with a folder of initial charges and statement summaries, not because Claire needed details yet, but because Ethan had asked for him. The request surprised Daniel enough that he made the nurse repeat it. "He woke up a little while ago," she said, outside the room. "He's groggy, but he asked if the sheriff caught the man in the truck." Daniel stood very still. He remembers the crash, some of it. Inside the room, Ethan looked thinner, pale against the hospital pillow, one side of his face marked by fading bruises. But his eyes were open, and in them sat that unsettling mix children sometimes had after trauma. Innocence still present but no longer unbroken. Claire sat beside him with one hand wrapped around his. She looked like someone standing inside a fragile miracle, afraid to move too quickly and crack it. Ethan turned his head slightly when Daniel entered. "Hey, Sheriff." Daniel stepped closer. "Hey, buddy." Ethan's voice was raspy. "Did you catch him?" Daniel pulled a chair near the bed and sat. He was careful with his answer. "We're catching everybody we need to catch." Ethan looked at him for a long moment, then asked the question Daniel had been dreading from the minute the boy first opened his eyes. "My dad did it, didn't he?" Claire closed her eyes, and Daniel saw her brace herself, not to stop the truth, but to survive hearing it said aloud. Daniel kept his gaze on Ethan. "Your dad caused the crash." Ethan swallowed. His fingers tightened weakly around his mother's hand. "Was he drunk?" Claire made a small sound that was almost a sob. Daniel did not look away. "Yes." Ethan stared at the blanket for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice held no tears, only stunned injury. "He promised me he quit." Claire leaned forward, pressed her forehead lightly to Ethan's knuckles, and let herself cry without sound. Daniel looked out the window for one respectful second, giving them a pocket of privacy within the room. Then Ethan asked, quieter, "Did he try to hurt me?" Daniel turned back. "No. He made terrible choices, but he did not mean to hit that bus." Ethan took that in. Children were often better at distinguishing intention from damage than adults gave them credit for. The problem was that they still had to live with the damage. "Can I see him?" Ethan asked. Claire lifted her head fast. "Not today." Ethan looked at her, then at Daniel. "I need to know if his face knows what happened." The sentence hit Daniel harder than he expected, because it was not a child's question, not fully. It was the question of someone whose trust had been injured, and now needed visual evidence of remorse, before deciding whether love could survive contact with the truth. Claire wiped her cheeks. "I don't know if I can do that yet." Ethan nodded slowly, which in its way was kinder than argument. Daniel stood. "You don't have to decide today." Ethan looked back at him. "Did my dad get followed?" Claire's head turned toward Daniel sharply. "Why would you ask that?" Ethan blinked. "Before the crash, at breakfast, he kept looking out the window. Then when we got near Main Street, I saw a black SUV behind us, before the bus turned. I thought maybe it was nothing." Daniel felt the room contract around the detail, not because it changed the core truth, but because it confirmed the pressure had been real, right up to the moment of impact. "It wasn't nothing," Daniel said gently. Ethan's eyes moved between the adults. "So everybody messed up." Daniel gave the smallest nod. "That's one way to put it." Ethan lay back, suddenly exhausted by the effort of being conscious inside a broken story. "That town sucks sometimes," he murmured. Claire laughed through tears before she could stop herself, and even Daniel smiled. "Yeah," he said softly. "Sometimes it really does." He left them there, mother and son still holding on to each other at the edge of a future neither of them wanted, but both were already entering, and as he walked back down the hospital corridor, he understood the shape of the next phase more clearly. The case was no longer about discovering whether deeper rot existed. It did. The question now was, what would be salvaged after everyone stopped pretending that private shame stayed private? Outside, in the parking lot, the afternoon sun lay flat across the windshields and bare trees. Daniel stood beside his cruiser for a moment, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. The story was moving toward consequences now, not just exposure. Travis would have to face his son. Claire would have to decide what part of her marriage had died, and what, if anything, remained. The town would have to sit with the fact that respectable men had built quiet profit on the fear of weaker ones. And Daniel, who had spent years telling himself he served this place because he loved it, would have to reckon with whether love meant protecting a town's self-image, or forcing it to see itself without the flattering light. He got into the cruiser and headed back toward Laramie Creek, where reporters, lawyers, grieving parents, and two newly arrested pillars of the community were all waiting under the same hard Wyoming sky, and where the next few days would decide not just who got charged, but who still recognized themselves when the dust finally settled. And where the next few days would decide not just who got charged, but who still recognized themselves when the dust finally settled. Daniel found the courthouse parking lot already clogged with news vans and local pickups. By the time he rolled back into town, the bright satellite dishes and coiled cables looking grotesquely out of place against the low brick buildings and the white church steeple beyond them. Reporters had a way of making any tragedy feel half-consumed before the people living it had even finished bleeding. Marcus met him at the side entrance, with two folders tucked under one arm, and a look that suggested the day had somehow managed to get louder since noon. "State boys picked up Grinnell outside Rollins," he said as they climbed the back steps. "Voss, too. Tried running. Didn't get far." Daniel stopped midway up. "Alive?" "Annoyingly." Daniel nodded once and kept moving. Inside, the sheriff's office hummed with ringing phones, copier noise, and the brittle fatigue of people who had stopped pretending they were going home on time. Deputy Ellen Pike was fielding calls from 3 different networks, while a patrolman, Daniel, barely trusted with parking tickets, was trying to keep 2 furious parents from barging into the interview room where Peter Weller sat with his lawyer. "Tell them I'll speak to them in 10, Daniel said. "And get the county attorney in my office." Marcus handed him one of the folders. "Also got the preliminary charging memo on Travis." Daniel took it without opening it. The weight of it in his hand felt disproportionate, as if paper could somehow hold the density of a child waking up to learn what his father had done. In his office, he shut the door and finally sat down. The charging memo was what he expected, and still hard to read. Aggravated DUI, vehicular assault, reckless endangerment, enhancements depending on the final injuries. Each line clinically precise, stripped of the human noise around it. Daniel had spent enough years in law enforcement to know precision mattered, but some days it felt obscene. Marcus stayed standing until Daniel looked up. "You want the full rundown before the attorney gets here?" he asked. Daniel nodded. Marcus opened his folder. Weller lawyered up fast. "Still denying criminal knowledge, says he only facilitated legitimate bridge financing between local business interests." Hansen gave a partial statement again. More honest now that he knows Grinnell's in custody. Claims Weller always kept 1 foot outside the room so he'd have deniability. "And Grinnell?" Daniel asked. Marcus's mouth tightened. According to state police, he smiled through the whole transport and asked whether this was really worth all the paperwork. Daniel almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That man thinks intimidation is just inconvenience with better margins." Marcus nodded. "Also, Voss is already trying to cut a deal." "Of course he is. He says he can place Weller at 2 meetings and Hansen at 4. Says the black SUV was supposed to lean on Travis, not chase him through the intersection." Daniel leaned back slowly. "Not chase him. Lean on him." Amazing what men think language can bleach. Marcus let that sit. "You want my honest read?" "Always. Everybody's telling the truth now, but only in the shape that leaves them room to still like themselves." Daniel looked at him for a long second. "That's better than most investigators twice your age." Marcus shrugged awkwardly. "My mother had 6 brothers and 3 divorces between them. Pattern recognition." The county attorney arrived with files, a legal pad, and the eager caution of a man trying to look solemn in a case he knew could elevate his career. Daniel respected him enough to work with him and distrusted him enough to watch his hands. They spent the next hour building the sequence for public charges, separating what they could prove today from what they would need corroborated tomorrow, and trying to keep the crash from being lost inside the wider conspiracy case. "Public sympathy is going to split," the attorney said. "Once people hear Travis was under pressure from Grinnell, some will want that to reduce culpability." Daniel kept his eyes on the memo. "It explains his panic. It doesn't reduce what he did behind the wheel. Legally, maybe not much. Morally," Daniel said, "it makes the town look in the mirror and see more than one face." The attorney tapped his pen. "Morality isn't chargeable." "No," Daniel said, "but it still shows up at sentencing, in marriages, at dinner tables, in what kids remember when they grow up and leave." The attorney, to his credit, did not try to argue that. By late afternoon, Daniel stood in the press room with County Seal behind him, microphones clustered like weeds, and half the state apparently watching a town that most of them had never heard of last week. He delivered the facts without decoration. Travis Holt had been charged in connection with the crash. Wade Grinnell and Leon Voss had been arrested on charges related to extortion, intimidation, and criminal conspiracy. Peter Weller and Earl Hansen had been taken into custody pending further proceedings involving financial coercion and related misconduct. He did not speculate. He did not dramatize. He did not answer the question, shouted from the back, about whether this proved corruption in local government goes all the way down, because questions like that were mostly requests to simplify decay into a slogan. But when a reporter from Cheyenne asked, "Sheriff Mercer, what do you say to parents who believe the town failed their children before the crash ever happened?" Daniel paused long enough that the room leaned toward him. "I say they have reason to feel that way," he answered. "And I say the work ahead is not just arresting people. It's deciding whether we tell ourselves this was one bad man's mistake, or whether we admit a lot of quieter failures set the table for it." The quote was on every local screen within the hour. By evening, people were arguing about it at the diner, in checkout lines, in church parking lots, and over kitchen tables where children were pretending not to listen. Laramie Creek had entered the stage of public grief, where blame turned social, and Daniel knew from experience that stage was often uglier than the event itself. People could rally around blood and sirens. It was much harder to rally around self-recognition. He left the office after dark only because Marcus physically blocked the doorway and said, "If you stay another 3 hours, your judgment's going to start sounding like philosophy, and that helps nobody." Daniel stared at him. Was that respectful insubordination? "It was hydrated insubordination," Marcus said, holding up a bottle of water. Daniel took the bottle and, to Marcus's visible relief, went home. His house sat at the edge of town, overlooking a shallow wash and a line of cottonwoods that bent in the wind every winter. It had been too quiet since his daughter left for college, and his marriage ended in the dry, exhausted way some Western marriages did. Not with one grand betrayal, but with years of polite erosion. He walked in, dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, and stood in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum. There was leftover chili in the fridge, mail on the table, a pair of boots by the back door he kept meaning to throw out. Ordinary life waiting patiently while extraordinary damage took up all the oxygen. He heated the chili, ate half of it at the counter, and found himself thinking about Claire's sentence in the hospital. Forever gets built out of days like this. He had known it when his own marriage went under, though he had used different words. Nobody loses a life in one scene. You lose it in accumulated weather. His phone buzzed at 9:17. "Claire." He answered immediately. "Everything okay?" "Depends what okay means," she said. Her voice was steadier now, but worn thin. "Ethan wants to see Travis tomorrow." Daniel set the spoon down. "You sure?" "No." She let out a tired breath, "But he's clear about it in a way that scares me. It doesn't feel impulsive. It feels like he's already building some version of the next years in his head, and he thinks he needs to look at his father to know what kind of story he's living in." Daniel leaned against the counter. "That sounds like Ethan. He got that part from me." A small pause. "Would you be there?" Daniel looked through the dark kitchen window at his own reflection. Older than he felt that morning, younger than he feared at night. "If you want, I think Ethan does." "Then yes." After they hung up, he stood still for a long moment. Not because he was surprised to be asked. In towns like Laramie Creek, the sheriff sometimes ended up serving as witness, translator, and unwanted conscience all at once. But because he knew tomorrow's meeting would matter more to that family than any press conference or indictment, the law would do what it did over months. A son deciding what remained of love after betrayal could happen in 10 seconds across a hospital room. The next morning brought wind sharp enough to sting the eyes. Daniel reached the hospital before Claire, and found Travis already awake in the secure ward, pale and unshaven. One arm immobilized, his face carrying that wrecked stillness some men wore after shame had finally stripped them of performance. "They told me Ethan wants to see me," Travis said when Daniel entered. Daniel stayed near the foot of the bed. "He does." Travis swallowed. "I don't know what face to make." The honesty of it irritated Daniel, and moved him at the same time. "Try your own," he said. Travis looked down at the blanket. "I don't think there's much left of it." "Then don't waste the little there is." Travis's eyes reddened. "Does he hate me?" Daniel thought of Ethan's careful voice. Not hateful, just altered. "He's 12, Daniel said. "He doesn't have a clean word for this yet." Travis nodded once, as if that was somehow worse. "You gonna tell me to man up, take responsibility, all that?" Daniel's gaze hardened. "No. I think life's already covering that. I'm telling you that when your son comes in here, this is not about you needing forgiveness to survive the hour. Travis's mouth tightened. I know. Do you? Daniel stepped closer. Because men like you spend years making your pain the center of the room. Booze, debt, lies, promises, fear, all orbiting your shame. If you do that for 1 second with Ethan, I will end the visit myself. Travis turned his face away, breathing hard through his nose. When he looked back, something in him had settled. Not healed, just stripped down to the necessary. I hear you, he said. Claire arrived with Ethan in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. Though the boy clearly hated the chair and would have walked if anyone allowed it, his bruises had yellowed at the edges. One wrist was wrapped. He looked smaller than he had before the crash, and somehow older too, as if pain had accelerated a private season. Claire stopped in the doorway. Ethan did not. He signaled the nurse forward until the chair reached the bedside. Travis saw him and broke open instantly, not into noise, but into a quiet devastation that seemed to cave his face inward. Hey, buddy, he whispered. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Daniel stayed near the door, not part of the family, and yet unavoidably present. Claire stood with one hand over her mouth, eyes shining with dread. Ethan spoke first. Did you lie to me when you said you quit drinking? Travis shut his eyes briefly. Yes. For how long? A while. Months. Travis nodded. Yeah. Ethan swallowed. Did Mom know? Claire answered before Travis could. I knew some. Not enough. Ethan turned his head slightly toward her, then back to his father. Were you trying to get away from those men? Travis's face twitched. Yes. Why didn't you tell us? Travis looked at the ceiling for half a second, then back to his son. Because I was ashamed, and because I thought I could fix it before it touched you. Ethan's jaw tightened. It touched me anyway. Claire made a broken sound. Travis nodded slowly, tears slipping now without resistance. It did. Ethan sat very still. I remember seeing the truck move. Then I remember the noise. Then I remember waking up and everything hurting. I thought maybe I dreamed it was you until the sheriff said your name. Travis shook with the effort of staying quiet. I'm sorry. Stop, Ethan said, and the word came out sharp enough that everyone in the room froze. Ethan drew a breath that trembled only at the end. I know you're sorry. Sorry is obvious. Daniel felt something inside him catch at that. It was not rehearsed. It was the brutal clarity hurt sometimes gave children when adults had wasted language. Ethan looked directly at his father. What I don't know is if you're still lying to yourself. Travis stared at him, stunned. I'm trying not to. That's not an answer. Claire lowered herself into a chair beside Ethan, not to interrupt, but because her legs might not hold otherwise. Travis licked his dry lips. No, he said finally. I'm not lying to myself right now. Ethan held his gaze. Then tell me the truth. All of it. Travis did. Not every legal detail, not every name, because Claire and Daniel cut him off when he started drifting toward the criminal specifics of the case. But he told the emotional truth. He told Ethan he had been scared for a long time and had confused secrecy with strength. He told him he kept choosing short relief over hard honesty. He told him he loved him, and that love had not prevented him from becoming dangerous. He told him fear and shame did not force his hand onto the bottle. They only made it easier to pretend. Ethan listened without crying. That was the hardest part for Claire to bear. If the boy had screamed or sobbed, she would have known how to respond. Instead, he listened like someone assembling the wreckage into a shape he could carry. When Travis finished, the room stayed quiet. Then Ethan asked, Are you going to jail? Claire shut her eyes. Travis looked at Daniel, then back to his son. Probably. Ethan nodded slowly. Okay. It was not forgiveness. It was worse and cleaner than that. Acceptance of consequence before emotion had caught up. He looked down at his wrapped wrist. I don't want you to die. Travis made a strangled sound. I don't plan to. But I don't know if I want to see you for a while either. Travis was openly crying now, too spent to hide it. That's fair. Ethan looked at him one more time, then at Claire. I'm done. The nurse moved the wheelchair back. Claire stood, torn in half between reaching for Travis and protecting Ethan from one more second in that room. In the end, she chose the boy. Before leaving, Ethan looked over at Daniel. Did I do that right? Daniel felt the full weight of the question. The impossible burden children carried when adults failed, and then left them to wonder if their response had been morally sufficient. Yeah, Daniel said quietly. You did. After Claire and Ethan were gone, Travis turned his face into the pillow and wept in the raw, ugly, unguarded way people only did when they had finally run out of all their masculine training. Daniel stood there for a moment, witness again, then left without offering comfort. Some grief deserved company. Some deserved to be endured. Outside the ward, Claire sat in the hallway with both hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Ethan leaned back in the chair with his eyes closed. Spent. Daniel crouched slightly to meet Claire's gaze. You okay to get him back to his room? She gave a small, disbelieving laugh. No, but yes. Ethan opened his eyes. Sheriff. Yeah. Are the other kids okay? Daniel nodded. Healing. Scared. Angry. Alive. Ethan absorbed that and looked relieved in a way that deepened Daniel's ache for him. Good, the boy whispered. I keep thinking about that. Claire touched Ethan's shoulder. You don't have to carry everybody. Ethan managed a weak half-smile. Somebody should. Daniel stood and watched them go. On the drive back to town, he understood with new clarity that the final arc would not be the arrests or even the trial dates. It would be whether Laramie Creek chose the more painful version of memory, the honest one. By afternoon, the town council had called an emergency public session to appoint interim replacements and pretend institutional procedure could get ahead of moral embarrassment. Daniel attended only because county matters now overlapped with half the people in the room. The chamber was packed. Peter Weller's empty seat drew more attention than any speech did. Citizens lined up at the podium to vent, condemn, defend, and in some cases reveal their own small humiliations. A roofer admitted he had once borrowed from Grinnell's Circle and said nobody should act surprised that desperation had been monetized here. A school librarian stood trembling as she described how tired she was of powerful men calling exploitation business. An elderly man who had known Weller since high school said, voice shaking, we all saw pieces of this and called it none of our business because it was more comfortable to think character problems belonged to other families. That line hung in the chamber longer than the applause that followed. Daniel spoke only once, near the end, after two council members started trying to frame everything as an isolated criminal enterprise, disconnected from broader civic culture. You can arrest 4 men and still keep the same habits that helped them thrive, he said. If this town wants to move on without changing anything about what it excuses, what it mocks, and what it refuses to see in men who are unraveling, then another version of this will happen. Maybe not a bus crash, maybe a suicide, maybe a foreclosure that turns violent, maybe a kid who grows up thinking silence is what love looks like. But something. No one clapped at first. Then a few did, not many. That was fine. Applause was often just emotional outsourcing. What mattered was the stillness afterward. That night, Daniel walked Main Street alone after the office finally cleared enough for him to leave. The intersection where the crash happened had reopened, though faint scrapes still marked the curb, and one patch of asphalt remained dusted with glitter no street sweeper had fully claimed. The grocery store had replaced its front window. Traffic passed normally now, which felt indecent and necessary at the same time. He stood on the corner and looked at the traffic light cycling through its colors as if the world had never paused here. Red, green, yellow, permission, warning, consequence. He thought about all the conversations already happening in town, some honest, some evasive, parents deciding whether to let children ride the bus again, wives looking differently at husbands who drank more than they admitted, men staring at their own unpaid bills with new fear, teenagers learning that adulthood was not a fortress, but a leak. Across the street, the diner sign buzzed faintly. Inside, people were eating pie under warm lights because life, obscene and stubborn, kept pairing itself with catastrophe. Daniel crossed over and went in. Nora Bell, the superintendent, sat alone in a booth with a coffee cup and a stack of forms. She looked up in surprise. Sheriff. Superintendent. He slid into the booth opposite her when she gestured. Paperwork, he said, nodding to the forms. Nora gave a joyless smile. Trauma counseling requests, transportation changes, parent notifications, the glamorous side of public education. The waitress poured Daniel coffee, without asking. He thanked her and looked back at Nora. How are the kids? Nora exhaled slowly. Depends which kid. Some are acting like nothing happened because that feels safer. Some won't go near a bus. One little girl asked if traffic lights can be trusted. Daniel stared into his cup. Can they? Nora considered him. That's not really what she was asking. He nodded. I know. Nora folded her hands over the paperwork. You think the town learns anything from this? Daniel looked through the diner window toward the intersection. Some people will, some won't. Some will for 6 months, and then drift back into whatever helps them sleep. That bleak, huh? That realistic. Nora studied him a moment. Still, you dragged a lot into daylight. Daniel let out a quiet breath. Daylight doesn't fix much by itself. No, Nora said, but mold hates it. That almost made him laugh. They sat in companionable silence for a minute, 2 public servants too tired for pretense. Finally, Nora said, I heard Ethan woke up. He did. And Daniel thought of the hospital room. Ethan asking whether his father's face knew what happened. And he's going to remember this town very clearly when he grows up. Nora looked down at her forms. Then maybe that's who we should be building for now. Daniel took a sip of the coffee. It was fresh, hot, slightly too bitter. Exactly right for the hour. Outside, Main Street traffic thinned as businesses shut their doors one by one, and the town settled into that uneasy quiet that follows public scandal, when everyone senses the worst facts are already known, but the true consequences have barely begun. Daniel sat there under the diner lights, feeling the story draw tighter around its final questions. Not who did what, because that was mostly on paper now, but what anyone could honestly rebuild once guilt, fear, and love had all been named in the same room. What anyone could honestly rebuild once guilt, fear, and love had all been named in the same room became clearer over the next week. Not all at once, but in the uneven, unglamorous way real consequences always arrived. Through hearings, meals not eaten, phone calls returned too late, children asking questions in the back seats of cars, and adults discovering that shame did not disappear just because someone else had been arrested for a bigger crime. The arraignments drew crowds that overflowed the courthouse steps and spilled into the street, half the town showing up either to witness accountability or to reassure themselves that they had never truly been part of the machinery that led there. Wade Grinnell appeared in a dark suit that looked rented and too smooth for his face, carrying himself with the same mild contempt he had worn during transport, as if all institutions were temporary obstacles designed to be outweighted. Leon Voss looked frightened, now that the bravado had worn off and the possibility of a long sentence had finally reached his bones. Peter Weller arrived with 2 attorneys and the stiff, insulted posture of a man who still believed public standing ought to function like armor. Earl Hansen came in work boots and a clean shirt, eyes down, already looking like a foreman at his own moral demolition. Travis Holt entered last in County Orange, slower because of his injuries, and the room changed around him. Reporters leaned forward, parents stared. Someone in the back muttered a curse, not quietly enough. Daniel watched from the wall near the side door and felt the old tension between law and spectacle tighten in him again. The judge read the charges with procedural calm, but nothing about the room was calm. When Travis heard the full list, he did not look toward the benches where townspeople sat. He looked only once, toward the rear, where Claire had chosen to stand instead of sit, hands buried in the pockets of her coat, as if she could keep herself from reaching for a life that no longer existed if she kept both hands occupied. Ethan was not there. Daniel was glad. Some truths needed record. Others did not need to be watched in real time by a 12-year-old boy still learning how to sleep through the night again. Outside, after the hearing, microphones swarmed the courthouse lawn, while the wind snapped at jackets and camera wires. Weller tried to speak first and was pulled back by counsel. Grinnell smiled at no one. Earl said, "No comment," with the broken sound of a man who had finally understood that silence now made him look exactly like what he had been. Travis said nothing at all. Daniel gave a brief statement and then stepped away before the questions turned interpretive. "Sheriff Mercer, do you think the town can recover from this?" "Sheriff Mercer," were warning signs ignored by law enforcement. "Sheriff Mercer, is this part of a wider culture of predatory lending in rural counties?" Each question had merit, and none of them could be answered cleanly on courthouse steps between weather gusts. "Recovery isn't a press statement," Daniel said finally. "It's what people do after the cameras leave." That line traveled too. He regretted it almost immediately, not because it was untrue, but because truth often became performance the second it proved quotable. By the following weekend, Ethan was home, moving carefully through his mother's sister's house, where Claire had chosen to stay, rather than return immediately to the Holt place. That decision alone became a quiet town referendum. Some people called it sensible, some called it cruel. A few, mostly women who had been weathering mail damage for years in more private ways, called it the first honest thing anyone in the Holt marriage had done in months. Claire ignored all of them. She spent her days managing follow-up appointments, medication schedules, insurance forms, and the strange emotional climate inside a house where everyone was grateful. Ethan had survived, and no one knew what shape gratitude should take when survival had been purchased through permanent loss. Daniel visited once at Claire's request, not as sheriff exactly, but because Ethan had asked whether the case was still real when it wasn't on television. Claire opened the door wearing jeans and an oversized sweatshirt, exhaustion softening her features into something plainer and, in a way, stronger. "He's in the back room," she said. "Megan took the kids to the park, so it's quieter." Daniel followed her down the hallway. On the way, she said, without looking at him, "I filed for temporary separation." Daniel nodded one. "How do you feel?" Claire let out a short breath that was not laughter. Like, people keep asking the wrong question. They ask if I still love him. That's not even the useful question right now. The useful question is whether love can coexist with the version of reality I'm willing to live in. Daniel glanced at her. And she stopped outside the bedroom door. I don't know yet. That honesty sounded healthier than certainty. Ethan was propped against pillows with a throw blanket over his legs and a stack of school assignments untouched on the nightstand beside him. He looked annoyed by the assignments, which Daniel took as a promising sign. Hey, Ethan said. Hey, Daniel pulled a chair over and sat. Your mom says you're bullying physical therapy. Ethan made a face. Physical therapy started it. Claire shook her head and left them with 2 glasses of iced tea. After she was gone, Ethan looked at Daniel for a while before speaking. Do you think my dad's a bad person? It was the kind of question adults like to answer with philosophy, because philosophy gave them distance. Daniel decided not to hide in it. I think your dad did dangerous, selfish, dishonest things, he said. I think he also loved you. Those 2 facts don't fit together comfortably, but they can both be true. Ethan picked at the blanket seam. That sounds like a politician answer. Daniel almost smiled. No, a politician answer would make one of those facts disappear so everybody could feel cleaner. Ethan considered that. Mom says people want simple villains because then they don't have to check themselves. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Your mom's smart. Yeah. Ethan looked toward the window. I keep thinking maybe if he was just evil, it'd be easier. It would, Daniel said. It would also teach you less. Ethan frowned at that. I don't want lessons. Nobody does when they come like this. The boy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, some kids at school texted me. One of them said my dad should rot. Another said it wasn't really his fault because those men were after him. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Reasonable response. I didn't. Also reasonable. Ethan shifted carefully against the pillows. What am I supposed to say when people ask? Daniel thought of the adults in town, each building their preferred moral arrangement. You say as much truth as you can carry that day. No more. Ethan nodded slowly. Can I hate what he did and still miss him? Yes. Can mom leave him and still be sad? Yes. Can town people act nice and still have helped this happen? Definitely yes. That made Ethan snort despite himself. Then his expression turned serious again. Do you ever get tired of knowing everybody's worst stuff? Daniel leaned back. The ceiling fan above them turned lazily, clicking once each rotation. Yeah, he said. But I get more tired when people pretend the worst stuff came from nowhere. Ethan absorbed that, then looked at the untouched schoolwork. I don't want this to be the thing I'm known for. Daniel followed his gaze. Then it won't be. It'll be one thing that happened to you. That's not the same as being you. Ethan stared at the papers like he wanted to believe that. Feels big. It is big. Daniel held the boy's gaze. Big things still have to share space with the rest of your life. That's how you beat them. When Daniel left, Claire walked him to the porch. The afternoon was cold and clear. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower was running. Absurdly ordinary. Thank you, she said, for talking to him like he's not breakable glass. Daniel put on his hat. He isn't. Claire looked out at the street. No, that's what scares me. He's adapting faster than I am. That's children, Daniel said. They survive first. Interpret later. Claire crossed her arms against the wind. Travis wants to call him once a week from county if Ethan agrees. And I told his lawyer I won't decide for Ethan, but I also won't push Ethan toward mercy to make adults feel morally accomplished. Daniel nodded. That sounds right. Claire looked at him then. Really looked. You ever regret staying sheriff this long? He took a second before answering. Some years I regret thinking the badge could save people from themselves. Other years I regret how cynical that thought sounds. Claire gave a small, tired smile. That's not an answer either. No, he admitted. It's just honest. Trial prep moved quickly once Voss agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced exposure. And his testimony did what cowardly men's testimony often did. It filled in the spaces everyone stronger had hoped would remain suggestive, instead of explicit. He described Grinnell's operation in the unadorned, transactional language of a man who had normalized intimidation as labor. He confirmed Weller's role in steering vulnerable contractors and workers toward bridge money, Hanson's role in granting access and silence, and the specific conversations in which Travis Holt had been discussed as soft enough to squeeze because of the kid. The phrase hit the town harder than some of the charges did. Soft enough to squeeze because of the kid. People repeated it in low voices at the grocery store and then looked ashamed to have repeated it. It was not new information exactly. It was merely the moment the town could no longer pretend coercion had remained abstract. A week later, Daniel stood outside the school gym as children filed out after a shortened assembly on recovery resources, and he watched parents study one another with the new cautiousness communities developed after scandal. Sympathy had become more complex. Suspicion had broadened. Men who once joked casually about debt and drinking now found that jokes landed differently. Women who had swallowed concern to avoid being called dramatic had slightly less patience for being dismissed. The town had not become better. Towns do not improve on narrative schedule. But certain lies had lost convenience. That mattered. Marcus joined Daniel near the flagpole. County attorney says Grinnell's likely to plead on part of it if the federal angle doesn't get bigger, he said. Weller still thinks he can talk his way into a misunderstanding. Daniel watched a father lift his daughter into a pickup. People like him confuse confidence with insulation. Marcus shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. You think Travis pleads? He should. Yeah. Marcus glanced toward the school doors. You know, before this, I thought the job was mostly finding out who did the bad thing. I'm starting to think it's mostly living with how many people helped make the bad thing possible, while telling themselves they didn't. Daniel looked at him. Congratulations. You've become depressing enough for promotion. Marcus laughed once. My mom would be proud. A month passed. The snow came once, light and indecisive, then melted into muddy shoulders along the roads. Ethan returned to school on a partial schedule with headaches, slower steps, and a gaze people learned not to meet for too long unless they meant it. Children adjusted around him in the mercifully clumsy way kids sometimes did, not with perfect sensitivity, but with quick returns to ordinary interests. Trading cards, basketball scores, homework complaints, the small democracy of adolescence refusing to let one tragedy rule every conversation forever. Adults were worse. Adults either avoided him altogether or overperformed gentleness. Ethan developed an expression Daniel privately called his courtroom face. Polite, watchful, older than it should have been. Claire rented a small duplex on the west side of town rather than keep living at Megan's. She found part-time work again at the dental office and told people as little as possible. Travis remained in county, attending required counseling, taking plea discussions through his attorney, and writing letters to Ethan he did not always send. Daniel knew this because once, during a procedural visit, Travis asked him, "How do you know if a letter helps the kid or just helps the guy writing it?" Daniel had answered, "Read it again and take out every sentence secretly asking to be forgiven." Travis had looked at him for a long time after that, and then nodded. Not long after, Ethan received a short note in careful handwriting. It contained no excuses, no declarations about being a changed man, no hidden demand that father and son begin healing on adult terms. It simply said that Travis was doing what he should have done a long time ago, which was telling the truth to professionals, taking the consequences without bargaining, and hoping Ethan would keep becoming himself, without feeling responsible for anybody else's shame. Ethan read it twice at the kitchen table, while Claire washed dishes and pretended not to watch him. Finally, he folded the note and said, "That one's okay." Claire dried her hands slowly. "You don't have to answer." Ethan looked at the paper again. "I know. Do you want to?" He thought for a long minute. "Not yet." Claire nodded. Neither of them said that not yet was, in its own way, a mercy. Spring pushed in early that year. At the first full town meeting after the plea agreements were announced, the gymnasium filled again, though the energy was different now. Less outrage, more weariness. The facts had hardened. Grinnell would serve time. Voss would serve less and disappear into another county, with his cooperation attached to him like a smell. Weller would resign in disgrace, plead to charges that ended his political life, and spend years trying to reintroduce himself to rooms that no longer wanted him. Hanson would lose the company, then the ranch house, then perhaps his marriage, though Daniel suspected the marriage had been leaving for years and only now found a public door. Travis would plead guilty, accept prison time, and live with the knowledge that sobriety arrived for him not as triumph but as the minimum decent response to irreversible damage. In the gym, citizens spoke less dramatically than before. A pastor suggested a community fund for families hit by predatory lending. A teacher asked for confidential financial counseling resources through the school district. A ranch widow stood and said, "We keep talking like shame is private, but private shame keeps getting paid for by children." That line stayed with Daniel. When his turn came, he did not give a speech so much as a summary of what had become obvious. "There isn't a finish line for this," he said. "There's no version where the right people plead guilty, and then we go back to feeling like this town is untouched by the conditions that let them operate. The best outcome available now is smaller than innocence. It's honesty. It's intervention sooner. It's less worship of pride and secrecy. It's more willingness to ask plain questions when people around us are coming apart." The room was quiet. not resistant, just tired enough to hear him. That won't fix everything, he added. But pretending we were helpless won't fix anything. Afterward, as people drifted out, Nora Bell caught up to him near the doors. You should run for something, she said. Daniel gave her a flat look. I'd rather chew tinfoil. Nora smiled. Good. Means you still have judgment. The sentencing day for Travis came under a clean blue sky that felt inappropriate. Ethan did not attend, by his own choice. Claire did. She sat alone this time, not because she had no support, but because solitude had become a clearer statement. Travis stood at the defense table thinner, sober, and visibly older than when this began. When the judge offered him a chance to speak, he did not look around the room for sympathy. He looked down at the paper in his hands, and then set it aside. I wrote something, he said, voice rough. But most of what I wrote sounded like I was trying to arrange my guilt into a shape I could survive easier. So I'm not going to read it. The courtroom stayed still. I drove drunk. I lied to my family. I let fear become everybody else's problem. Other men pressured me. Yes, that's true, but I was not a puppet. I was a coward. My son is alive, and I thank God for that every morning. The fact he's alive does not reduce what I did. It only means I have to live long enough to understand it better. Daniel watched the judge listening. Claire did not cry. She looked at Travis with an expression almost impossible to summarize. Grief, anger, memory, pity, and the small, hard core of distance required to keep standing. When sentence was handed down, there was no dramatic outburst, just the scrape of chairs, the clink of cuffs, the end of one phase. Travis turned once before being led away, not toward the spectators generally, but toward the space where Claire sat. She did not nod, did not smile, did not forgive, but she held his gaze for one full second. It was not nothing. It was not reconciliation. It was acknowledgement that they had shared a life real enough to damage. Some endings only deserved that much. Weeks later, on a mild evening with the light lingering past 7, Daniel found himself once more at the intersection on Main Street. The town had installed a new crosswalk signal and trimmed back the hedges near the grocery store for better visibility. Practical changes. Small ones. The sort that made official minutes and helped people feel action had occurred in the realm they could measure. A bus stopped at the light, children's faces visible in the windows, laughing at something inside their own world. Daniel stood on the sidewalk and watched until the light changed and the bus rolled safely through. You look like a man waiting for symbolism to do something impressive, Marcus said from behind him. Daniel turned. You off duty, technically. But my mother says if I don't stop by the diner before 8, she'll tell people I forgot where I came from. Daniel nodded toward Main Street. Town feels quieter. Marcus came to stand beside him. That good or bad? Too early to say. Marcus followed his gaze to the disappearing bus. You hear from Ethan. Saw him last week. He was arguing with another kid about whether the Rockies will ever get competent pitching. That sounds healthy. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. It does. They started walking toward the diner, passing the grocery store, the church, the courthouse steps where cameras had once crowded shoulder to shoulder. The town looked almost ordinary now, which Daniel knew was how most real change hid itself. Not in visible transformation, but in the altered meaning of familiar things. At the diner door, he glanced back once more at the intersection. He thought of the first crash photograph on his desk, of the sneaker in the road, of Ethan asking if he had done it right, of Claire saying forever gets built out of days like this. She had been right, but forever also got rebuilt that way, through days less dramatic and more deliberate, through questions asked earlier, through pride interrupted, through children who learned different definitions of strength than the ones that had wrecked their fathers. Daniel opened the diner door and let the warm noise spill out around them. Plates clattering, coffee pouring, somebody laughing too loud in a corner booth, life refusing purity, refusing neatness, refusing to stop just because people had discovered what they were capable of. And for the first time since the bus crash split the town open, Sheriff Daniel Mercer felt something that was not relief and not peace, but close enough to steadiness to trust for one evening, the kind that came when damage had not been undone, but had finally stopped pretending to be invisible.